You could almost set your clock to it. You will know that the northern hemisphere is warming up and that spring is turning to summer when you start seeing notifications of all the kinds of lessons about immodesty getting preached. Because that seems to be when Christians, especially preachers, start thinking about immodesty. And a lot is made about immodesty and modesty in Christian circles. And the reason why those conversations tend to take place as spring turns into summer is because so much of our conversation about immodesty in churches today centers on women, centers on the clothing or lack thereof that may be worn, especially as the weather heats up. But is this really what God had in mind when he was concerned about immodesty in the days of the New Testament? What do Paul and Peter talk about when they talk about matters of concern when it comes to modesty? That is the reason for our conversation today. We need to be clear about a couple things as we begin. First of all, modesty is not about any kind of hemline or clothesline. Modesty and immodesty are dispositions. They're character traits. Modesty is the attempt to not draw undue attention to oneself by what one is presenting or doing. Immodesty, therefore, is the attempt to draw attention to yourself, often undue attention to yourself, through what one is wearing or what one is doing. So, yes, it has something to do with clothing, but it's not clothing. And secondly, just as importantly, not more so, the New Testament, for that matter, even the Old Testament, nowhere legislate a particular kind or style of dress that people should wear. Yes, you may be thinking, well, Deuteronomy, didn't it say that a man should not wear the garment of a woman shouldn't wear the garment of a man? That is true. It does say that in Deuteronomy, but notice there that the law did not specify what kind of garments those were. Even there, they were understood to be culturally masculine or feminine, and they were supposed to observe those cultural standards. In terms of the New Testament, almost everyone in the Greco-Roman period was wearing tunics, and then men would wear togas on top of the tunic. That was the standard dress that was worn by everyone, everywhere. So as we're going to see, immodesty in terms of not wearing clothing was not a significant concern or issue in the period of time in which the New Testament was written, because everybody was wearing tunics and or togas. We today are not wearing tunics or togas. Nowhere in the New Testament is it demanded that people wear tunics or togas. Clothing has always been and always is going to be very contextually dependent. We have matters of liberty when it comes to clothing. We are not required in any way, shape, or form to conform to exactly what they were wearing in Greco-Roman times, in the 1500s, 1600s, 1800s, 1950s, or even 1990s, or even just a few years ago. We are not thus bound. What we wear, the styles of clothing we wear, are in fact matters of liberty. Let's keep this in mind as we look at the passage that everybody turns to when it comes to modesty and immodesty discussions in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 9, which Peter parallels in 1 Peter 3, 3 and 4. Likewise, the women are to dress in suitable apparel, with modesty and self-control. Their adornment must not be with braided hair and gold or pearls or expensive clothing. Now let's look at and break down each one of these parts. So to adorn themselves in respectable apparel. Respectable there is the Greek word kosmios, which means well-arranged. It means orderly, seemly, or modest, according to Thayer. It is used later in that same book, in chapter 3 and verse 2, to describe the elder. An elder is supposed to be respectable. He's supposed to be orderly in his life and conduct. Notice with modesty and self-control, that is the disposition, the character attributes behind the kind of clothing being worn, reinforcing that the clothing is not modesty. Modesty is the attribute or character disposition that one then would display in clothing. Or, if contrary, immodesty would be the character attribute displayed in what one is wearing. That word for modesty is eidos, which is sense of shame or honor, modesty, bashfulness, reverence, or respect in there. That reverence, respect aspect of it is why in Hebrews 12 and 28 it's used a way to describe how we serve God. That is translated as reverence there and in other passages. Self-control is Greek sophrosune. The standard self-control, soundness of mind, sobriety standard that all Greco-Roman world, all your Greco-Roman philosophers are all encouraging sophrosune. They're all encouraging that kind of self-control, modesty, self-restraint in all things. It's also used by Paul in Acts 26:25 when Festus cries out, "Paul, you've gone mad because of your great learning." Paul wants to say, "No, I have not. I am of sound mind. I have sophrosune. I am self-controlled here. I have not gone crazy." Not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. And that's the thing. What is the contrary here? What does Paul and Peter look at as immodesty here? And we can see that it's about what they're wearing in terms of displaying wealth. Because what's the issue with braided hair and gold and pearls and things of that nature? Well, sometimes people have taken this as kind of an absolute throughout all time thing and condemn anyone who has braided hair, anyone who would wear any kind of gold or pearls. But what's going on here in context? And then maybe we can see where there might be application. Braided hair. We're not talking about some basic kind of French, braid that girls like to put in their hairs. What we're talking about here is the fact that in the ancient world, Roman world, to have braided hair would require the work of one or more slaves dedicated to the braiding of that hair, which means that you have enough money that you've got the regular slaves doing all the work in the fields, which even a lot of poor people would have at least a slave or a couple slaves. But you've got enough that not only have slaves in the field, you got slaves that all they can do is braid your hair. And we're not talking like basic braids. We're talking elaborate beehives. If you see some of the Roman statuary at the time, you can see some of the styles that were being used. And so they're very ornate, ostentatious. They display that you've got money. And that's the only purpose they exist. They exist to show, hey, look how rich I am. Look at what I can have done to me. Gold jewelry and pearls are the same type of thing. It's a display of that kind of wealth. To have that kind of jewelry means that you have enough money that you can buy that kind of wealth. But also, you don't need it to, buy food. You have enough for food and resources that you can now wear it. And just imagine being in a mixed assembly where you got some Christians who have some money, some Christians who are very poor. And imagine being a Christian who is poor and looking over at a sister in Christ who's wearing enough jewelry that could buy food for your family for years on end. And what that might mean and how that might make you feel. And now you can kind of get a much better feel for why there's this great concern from Paul and Peter when it comes to what's being worn as displaying wealth. And that leads to the last one, fine clothing. Today we're very brand obsessed. That normally in our conversations about displaying wealth and clothing, it tends to be based on brand, not material quality. In antiquity, it was very much about material quality. Most people owned one, maybe two garments, and they would be rough garments. What I mean by that is they're just what the women in the house could weave and spin on when they're not doing other things. So they would be made out of more rough materials that were on hand, often patched, where there might have been rips, tears, and things of that nature. Fine clothing would have involved maybe higher quality linen or cotton, or by this time we're starting to see silk introduced from the eastern markets coming in on the Silk Road and via India from China. And we even see a lot of Greco-Roman moralists condemning the craze for silk. It would also involve being dyed with things like purple or other dyes, and all again would indicate wealth. And in the New Testament, therefore, the concerns about immodesty involve people showing off their wealth by means of clothing and adornment, or aspiring to reach a certain social class and standing by presenting as if one has that kind of wealth in the way that they're dressing and conducting themselves. That's what Paul and Peter are really aiming at when it comes to immodesty in the New Testament. And this is not just a Paul and Peter thing. Tertullian is a witness that lives and writes around 190 to 205, so about 150 years after Paul and Peter. And what does Tertullian have to say? So we're going to read some sections from On the Apparel of Women. We're going to point out what he has to say here. If there dwelt upon earth a faith as great as is the reward of faith, which is expected in the heavens, no one of you at all, best beloved sisters, from the time that she had first known the Lord and learned the truth concerning her condition, would have desired too gladsome, not to say too ostentatious, a style of dress, so as not rather to go about in humble garb, and rather to affect meanness of appearance. And do you think about adorning yourself over and above your tunics of skins? Come now, if from the beginning of the world the Milesians sheared sheep, the Syrians spun trees, and the Tyrians dyed, and the Phrygians embroidered with the needle, and Babylonians with the loom, and pearls gleamed, and onyx stones flashed, if gold itself had already been issued, with the cupidity that accompanies it from the ground, if the mirror too already had license to lie so largely, Eve, expelled from paradise, already dead, would also have coveted these things, I imagine. No more, then, ought now she to crave, i.e., Christian women, or be acquainted with, if she desires to live again, what, when she was living, she neither had or known. Accordingly, all these things are the baggage of woman in her condemned and dead state, instituted as if to swell the pomp of her funeral. That's the beginning of it, and also the third section of that whole treatise. That's where Tertullian starts with. He wants to make clear in his second chapter, in section 5, that these suggestions are not made to, of course, to be developed into an entire crudity and wildness of appearance. He's not saying that they should just completely give up on and not care what they look like. Nor are we seeking to persuade you of the good of squalor and slovenliness. It's not an encouragement to go out and be dirty, but of the limit and norm and just measure of the cultivation of the person. There must be no overstepping of that line to which simple and sufficient refinements limit their desires, the line which is pleasing to God. So he first is saying, hey, all of these great things weren't, gold and fancy clothes were not known in the days of Eve. If Eve had, she would have wanted them, and it would have led to her death. If you're going to find salvation, you're not going to want some of these things. You're going to be just okay with your basic clothing, and not some of these refined clothing. He does say, here, you should be, you're not supposed to go out looking, we'd probably use the term frumpy, but some is completely not caring about your look, being dirty, and all that kind of stuff. Instead, he wants this kind of basicness. And this really gets into this last section here. Well, it is urged by some, let not the name be blasphemed in us if we make any derogatory change from our old style and dress. So he's anticipating the argument. Well, we shouldn't look different than we used to. We shouldn't have the name blasphemed because now we look worse than we did before. And he then responds with this sarcastic invective. Let us then not abolish our old vices, he says. Let us maintain the same character, if we must maintain the same appearance as before. And then truly the nations will not blaspheme. If you don't need to change the way you look, you don't need to change your habits either, is what he's saying. A grand blasphemy is that by which it is said, ever since she became a Christian, she walks in poor garb. That, of course, is the thing, the indictment, right? Well, she became a Christian, now she looks poor. She's dressing like she is poor now because she became a Christian. That would be social death, social ostracism, social exclusion, definitely taking a hit on the social scale. And that concern is behind why the people say we need to keep up the same standards we had before. What does Tertullian say to that? Will you fear to appear poorer from the time that you have been made more wealthy, and fouler from the time when you've been made more clean? Is it according to the decree of the Gentiles or according to the decree of God that it becomes Christians to walk? Now, let me be very clear. Tertullian is a problematic character in a lot of ways. He's very legalistic. He's very strict with a lot of the way he looks at things. In fact, he will leave what is called orthodoxy today for Montanism because he felt like the Orthodox are being a little too relaxed in their standards. He's a misogynist. He also is going to come out for women's makeup. He does tend to have a derogatory view of women. We got to be honest and open about that. And so, yes, Tertullian absolutely is an extreme. But I'd like to suggest that Tertullian, even in his extremity, is a lot closer to what Paul and Peter are talking about in terms of modesty and immodesty than much of what passes for modesty and immodesty discourse today in a lot of Christian circles. And that's why we need to really allow this to really settle within us, that in the New Testament, concerns about immodesty primarily and fully are about displaying wealth through one's clothing and presentation in ways that demonstrate one's attempt at maintaining or aspiring to a certain social class, in ways that could be seen as considering others as less than. That we should not be seeking to reinforce class structure or class aspirations in what we are wearing and how we're presenting ourselves. And that's a big part of what passes for immodesty. And modesty, of course, would be to be willing to wear the more simple things, to redirect your use of finances away from dolling yourself up, presenting yourself in certain ways, and using those resources in different ways to help others to glorify God in Christ. So how then should we treat immodesty concerns today? We first need to clear the air about the way immodesty is currently conceived of and discussed. Because normally when I speak of immodesty, Christians are immediately going to start thinking of a lack of clothing and a exposed skin or sexually suggestive clothing, or what is deemed sexually suggestive clothing, generally regarding women. And I want to really focus on that for a moment and think about how we got here. How did we get to the point when we think about immodesty, that's what we think of? And in fact, we have unfortunately inverted the very teaching of the apostles regarding modesty and immodesty. How many of you have heard the argument put forth that, well, we need to give our best to God, and we need to wear our best clothing when we are in the assembly. We need to honor God like we're at a wedding or something. We should wear the finest clothing we have to assemble with the saints. I think that people who make that argument may be well-intentioned, but I want to really break that down. What would it mean to wear your best clothing? Who determined what your best clothing is? What is best clothing? For most of us, we would associate best clothing with high quality or brand name suits and dresses. And they are high quality brand name suits and dresses. Not because that's what God decreed from long ago, but because in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that's what rich people wore. And that's what rich people maintained as a standard. And that middle class people and poor people who wanted to fit in an environment like the wealthy or to look like they were among the wealthy would either buy or make suits or dresses that would somewhat at least look like that. So they could maintain these kind of class aspirations. And so is that what Christians are intending on doing when they make this argument? Probably not, but that is what it is in the end. And what it means is that however well-intentioned, this argument, which by the way comes with no scriptural backing, there is not one verse that says anything I said about you should wear your best for God, you need to put on your best clothing for the assembly, because it is in fact antithetical to what the scriptures teach. It is contrary to what Paul and Peter were teaching when it came to modesty in conduct and behavior and clothing, where they said that you want to avoid putting on wealth and to wear the finest clothing when you assemble with the saints in your daily conduct, because of the kind of thing Tertullian would mention, that, oh, you're dressed in poor garb now that you're a Christian. Yes, because you are no longer putting your investment and confidence in social aspiration, social standing, and the wealth that goes along with that. You are putting your trust in Jesus and using the resources he gives you differently. Therefore, if we are to say you should wear your best to church, we are going against what God has made known in Christ. And this is where the traditions of men and these things that creep in from other places, not from the Spirit of God, have led us to very dark places and places that are contrary to God's purposes. And we can see this because poor people, when they come into the assembly, they don't feel welcomed when they see people in nice suits and dresses because they don't have the resources for their nice suits and dresses. And when they try to wear their best, they're often condemned for it because it is not sufficiently modest according to the standards set by those who are middle class and wealthy. And this is also why people get the idea they have to clean up their act in life before they can even join the assembly of the saints, because they come and they see people who are putting on the airs as if they got everything together, because they feel like I have to act like I have it all together and look well put together in order to serve God effectively at this place, which again works entirely against what God's purposes is for the assembly. And we've gotten there because of how we have baptized certain social customs and focused on certain things and have missed what the New Testament has taught in the environment in which we have found ourselves. Because as we've noted, in the Greco-Roman world, there were no concerns about a lack of clothing because everybody wore certain kinds of basic clothing. So the concern that clothing would be too sexually suggestive or that not enough would not be a standard day-to-day concern. How many times have women been condemned because of the kinds of dresses they wear in the assembly because they may expose too much in the leg or on the chest? But where do they get the idea they need to wear dresses? From that idea they need to wear their best and that social aspirations thing going on. And women can't win because if they wear dresses, they're too revealing, but if they were to show up in t-shirts and jeans, they'll be condemned as either being too casual or because of the way those t-shirts and jeans would fit. And we really need to think, how have we gotten here? How have we gotten to the point we have truly inverted what the Bible has taught us about immodesty? To turn immodesty from wearing things that project wealth and standing to not wearing enough clothing. And to make it not just about not wearing enough clothing, but specifically the policing of women's bodies and their presentation among the people of God. We need to sit in that and wonder how we've gotten there, because it didn't come from the Spirit of God, I can guarantee you that. It didn't come from Jesus. It came from some of these worldly influences around us. Sometimes the worldly influences can come from what are deemed conservative spaces as much as from what are deemed liberal or progressive spaces as well. So how are we supposed to address matters of modesty and immodesty? We have to go back to what the New Testament teaches, which is modesty or immodesty are dispositions that reflect themselves in our presentation, in clothing and attitude. Therefore, if we want to be modest, we do not want to draw attention to ourselves, we will dress and conduct ourselves accordingly. If in our fear, anxiety, our social striving, we want to draw attention to ourselves, we will dress and or act in ways that will draw attention to ourselves in those ways. Now you can understand why it does prioritize appearance. That's a very easy way of kind of understanding this very situation. But we need to remember how contextual clothing is. It's not going to do very well for us to have a Tertullian level condemnation of people because they have more than two types of garments. We find ourselves in many situations that require different kinds of clothing. And that's perfectly fine because we find ourselves in different situations and we have different types of clothing for it. It would make no sense to condemn somebody for wearing work clothes at work and then a suit at a wedding where that's the kind of clothing level that is expected of everybody. Why would we get up there and say, well, you would never wear your work clothes if you work at a factory to a wedding? Sure, but you also wouldn't wear your wedding tux to your blue-collar job at work. If you go to a beach, you're probably going to wear different clothing than if you're up in the mountains. You got different clothing in different situations. And in all these situations, Christians are called upon to consider issues of modesty and modesty. One issue might be the exposure of skin, how much skin that we're exposing in a given context. That may be one of the concerns, but another one of the concerns, and one that definitely has biblical merit, is what kind of wealth am I trying to project in this moment? So, if you are going to the beach, that needs to be a concern. What are you wearing? Are you going to be wearing clothing that's suitable for the beach, that is appropriate for the beach, and yet is not immodest for the beach? That's also true when you go to work. If you go to various social functions, what social functions are you going to? Are you finding yourself being encouraged to go to social functions where all of a sudden you are really concerned about the brand that you're wearing because the whole thing is an attempt to show off various forms of social standing and privilege? Is that really what Christians should be about and doing? So we can find ways of being modest or modest in any context. And ironically, in some of the drives toward what is called modesty, the kind of clothing styles that are being worn in various situations actually are immodest because they're drawing undue attention because of the fact that they don't fit the standard. They don't fit the customs of the time. So we do need to give some care and concern that we fit into that same kind of thing that Tertullian was talking about. Maybe not to his extreme, granted, but we are to try to find ways to look put together and presentable in a situation without putting on class aspirations while standing or trying to draw attention to ourselves by what we're exposing. That's going to be true in any and every circumstance in which we find ourselves. When it comes to assemblies, situations we have control over, like the assembly, because, what you wear at work, what's going on in other places we may not have control. But at assembly we have control. We should be wearing regular clothing. What are we wearing on a day-to-day basis? That's what we should be wearing at the assembly. Not more, not less. And that's going to be different in different places. Some places it might be business casual. Some places it might be far more informal. We should not look far more casual than we do in our regular life, unless for some reason in our regular life we have to wear a certain level of clothing. And we also shouldn't be putting on airs by trying to dress excessively formally in those situations. It goes back to what is modesty. Modesty is not drawing attention to yourself. And walking in fancy suit is drawing attention to yourself by that. Walking in dressed, being completely filthy and unkempt would also be doing the same thing. We've got to give that concern in all situations. And of course, our concern needs to go beyond just clothing. We also need to have concern about how we are presenting ourselves, right? In terms, if I'm wearing a certain t-shirt and jeans in a regular circumstance, but when I walk in the room, I take over, I interrupt people, I make people feel less than, that is just as immodest as if I was walking in wearing very little clothing at all. So we got to think about all these things when it comes to modesty. This doesn't mean that modesty is less of a concern or that we should not take it seriously. In fact, it is a greater concern. We live in a very immodest age. People want to point out how a lot of clothing is more revealing and sexually suggestive than before. And there are ways you can point to that, and that is very valid. And there are ways in which that kind of thing can suggest immodesty and lead to immodesty if that's what's going on. But there's a lot of brand consciousness going on today, right? And even among a lot of Christians. And that also suggests immodesty. If we have to have a certain kind of brand, a bag or clothing, why? Why do we need to have a certain brand of clothing or bag? Now, I understand the arguments about quality. And you can make the good argument that you want to buy certain items that come from a higher quality source because they'll last longer and you will save money in the end as opposed to buying cheaper goods. But when it comes to the kind of brand designer concept, like luxury, designer, these very words are demonstrating the concern, right? Because what is the difference between a luxury designer bag versus a regular bag? Or clothing versus, the same thing. The markup is 100, 200, 500% or more simply for brand value, simply to show that you can afford it. That, hey, look, this is my display of wealth. It's the very kind of immodesty that Paul and Peter and Tertullian were critiquing in the New Testament and immediately afterward. That is very much part of the immodesty. And in a world of social media where we're constantly hustling and selling ourselves, trying to put our best face forward and selling ourselves as the good, modesty rarely gets you the job or the social standing. So there's all these ways that there is immodesty out there. And we focus on certain things that involve mostly women's bodies, but there's a whole domain. And hey, my fellow preachers, that Bible, why do you need to have a lambskin Bible that costs hundreds of dollars? I understand wanting a decent quality Bible. I understand wanting certain ways of having the text look so that it's easy to read or to you make notes. But some of this conversation about Bible quality definitely is entering the category, isn't it, of the kind of thing Paul and Peter and Tertullian are worried about there. Do we need to have that? What does it try to demonstrate and display when we have things like that? That we need to have the finer goods when it comes to a Bible or the clothes that we wear and so on and so forth. We can fall prey to this very kind of immodesty because we're not putting it on our radar, because when we focus on immodesty as what women are wearing or not wearing, we're missing all the various forms of immodesty we ourselves can fall prey to. Yeah, Tertullian is a bit stern and legalistic. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise, but we all would probably do better if we just sat in his critique and exhortation for just a few minutes to ask ourselves, what does Jesus really think of the various expenditures and behaviors we justify in our pursuit of class aspiration, social respectability, or standing? And so, immodesty is absolutely a challenge in 21st century society. But our discourse remains very fundamentally distorted and warped because we invert the apostolic exhortation witness and we are selective in what we focus on and our concern and what we neglect in likewise. That modesty and immodesty are dispositions that we manifest in our appearance and our behavior. We can't just reduce them to hemlines. And that all of us need to aspire to modesty, to look and act appropriately in each and every situation, to resist the impulse to look and act in certain ways in order to gain social standing or status. And then we really need to look at the beam in our own eye. Because how many of our concerns about immodesty in others really say more about us than that other person? Sometimes it may point out some of the other person, but a lot of times it also says a lot about ourselves, right? And our own stumbling blocks than we would care to admit. We need to make sure our concerns about immodesty are informed by what Peter and Paul were concerned about, and not just the ways that we kind of shunt immodesty into a very different box today, in the concern of projecting or displaying wealth or social status and standing, and the attempt to gain influence through display of oneself in whatever form. We might need to change our clothing. We may need to cover up. We also may need to wonder if we don't need some of these brands, and that we find ways of displaying ourselves in decent clothing that is not as expensive and not projecting wealth, and to use the money that we have in different ways to glorify and honor God. We need to maybe think, what kind of Bible cover do I really need? We may need to think about, do I really need to take that selfie every time I'm doing something to get the accolades, see what kind of a good person I am? And it might mean that we need to reconsider how we act in the room, how much we impose ourselves on others, how well we're regarding others, and so on and so forth. At the same time, we got to be honest. Jesus also said in Matthew 5:13-16, we're the light of the world, and that we need to do our good deeds for men so they will glorify God who is in heaven. And so that seems to go completely against everything we've been talking about. Yet, both of those remain true at the same time. We need to be modest, not drawing attention to ourselves unduly, but we also need to be out doing good work so that people will see that and glorify God. And there is a way forward. It's going to be a challenge to work through that, but that's the challenge that we're given. We don't just get to throw our hands and give up or just point to one to the exclusion of the other and act like the other one is not there. And therefore, let us strive toward modesty in all ways, and resist all forms of modesty, and glorify God in Christ through the Spirit. We're so glad that you've joined us. Thank you for being with us today in this lengthy conversation about immodesty. We encourage you, please let us know your thoughts and comments. And please do so modestly in our conversation. Please continue in the comments. My name is Ethan. I'm with the Adventist Church of Christ in Los Angeles, California. We would love to be of encouragement and service to you. If we can be of any further service, if we can pray for you, if you'd like to study with us, if you'd like to meet with us, let us know. Reach out to us at AdventistChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on social media at Adventist Church of Christ. We again thank you. May the Lord bless and keep you, and make his face to shine upon you until we're able to meet again.